Welcome everyone, my name is Ben Clark, I'm the Director of Future Worlds. We are the on-campus startup accelerator here at the University of Southampton. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. We're really excited to have Catlin join us today for a fireside chat. Before we get started though, a little bit of housekeeping, just to remind you all, we're going to be having some Q&A during the event towards the end. Use the live chat on the side of the video, so sign into YouTube so you can put your questions in there. We'll be drawing questions from that chat later on for Karen during the event. So make sure you engage in the chat with other people during the event as well, if any points come up. So engage in the chat. Also to let you know, particularly if you've registered for the event, if for whatever reason we have a problem on YouTube, the link falls away, we've got a backup link that we will seamlessly transition onto. So we will email that out to everyone who's registered. If you haven't registered, then just go to the Future Worlds channel where you'll find the backup link kicks in. So if for whatever reason we lose contact, we will go straight back onto that. Other than that, again, just a thank you for joining us. And let's just think, why is it that we're here? Well, we're here because as a startup accelerator, we fervently believe in the potential of startup founders to have an outsized impact on the world. These are the people who are shaping and building the world of tomorrow. But if we want that to positively impact everyone, then everyone needs to be positively engaged in that process. But shockingly, only 2% of venture capital in the UK and globally goes to female-led tech startups, and less than 3% to women, less than 2% to startups founded by people from ethnic minorities. That is shocking for these huge underrepresented groups, but it's also bad for everyone. A lack of diversity in that ecosystem is bad for the whole world. But it's not limited to just tech startups. It goes far wider. And of course, if we want the world to be better going forward, then people like me who come from privilege, from overrepresented groups, have got to stand up and we have to take action. But if you're like me, then for many of us, we don't quite know where to start. We can be inhibited by not being sure or being nervous of doing the wrong thing. And so that is why I've been so excited. It's relatively recently that Grace Burton on the Future Worlds team introduced me to Catlin and the Better Allies movement. And it's been so helpful in challenging me and helping me to see how I can move just beyond empty words into actions and how that can really make a difference. And that's why I'm so excited that Karen is joining us this evening. Karen, you spent 25 years building software products, latterly as Vice President of Engineering for Macromedia and then Adobe. And then from there, you led this movement, you pioneered this movement, the Better Allies, writing the book as well. I mean, I'd love it. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd love it if you'd just start by giving us a bit of the backstory of how did you come to do all of this?
Thank you, Ben, for hosting me, and shout out to Grace Burton for her work to make all of this happen. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you. And yes, the backstory. So the backstory, as you mentioned, I was working in tech for 25 years. During that 25 years, I noticed a decline happening in gender diversity in the industry. And this is not well known, but there used to be more women getting computer science degrees and joining the tech industry back when I started my career a long time ago. It did decline. And while I was still a vice president at Adobe, I decided I had a role to play for women at my company. So I started our employee resource group for women. I started mentoring a lot of women and simply like advocating for gender diversity in various meetings I was attending, looking out for women. And then I have to tell you, I love doing this so much that over time, I was like, I want to be doing this kind of advocacy work full time, helping women not just at my company, but kind of across tech to grow their careers and stay in this industry because we needed them so much. We needed that diversity. So this goes back a number of years now, 9 years. I started my own leadership coaching business focused on women working in tech. And I love leadership coaching. It's still part of my business today. But here's the thing. I had a big problem with my leadership coaching practice for women in tech. And the big problem wasn't with my clients, because they're all amazing. The big problem was with their companies. Their companies where they were working were not true meritocracies where people could get ahead, grow their careers based on their merits, the work they were doing. And the reason I knew this is because all of those tech companies that they were working at, the closer you got to the C-suite, to the CEO, just the maler and paler it got. And with all due respect to those of us who are listening today who are male and or pale, I'm white myself, that's just what the demographics are like in most tech companies and in other industries as well. So I started to realize to truly help my coaching clients, I needed to make all of tech more inclusive. Now, you may be laughing at me. All of tech, Karen, you're one person. That's kind of a big job. But I was determined. And of course, the first thing anyone does these days when they want to change the world is they start a Twitter handle. So back in 2014, I started a Twitter handle @BetterAllies to share simple everyday actions anyone could take to be more inclusive at work. Simple things like, I pledge to notice when interruptions happen in the meetings I attend and redirect the conversation back to the person who is interrupted with, hey, I would like to hear Grace finish her thought, something like that. So I'm just tweeting these ideas, these actions people could take at work, maybe a couple a day. When things would come in through the news, such as a few years ago, a lot was coming out about Uber and how toxic their workplace was, especially for the women working there. And when I'd see something like that in the news, like some example of what was going on at Uber, I'd head over to Twitter and I would tweet something like, I do not use the nursing mother's room for my personal phone calls, unlike Travis Kalanick was doing that at Uber, right? Because that's not cool, because then the nursing moms can't use the room for what they need it for. Okay. So tweeting a little bit every day, a tweet or two. Then I started getting speaking engagements, Ben, and it was an anonymous Twitter handle. I did not have my name associated with this at all. I started getting speaking engagements, and people would say, hey, does anyone who's part of the Better Allies movement do any public speaking? And I'd be like, the movement? Like, it's just me tweeting a couple times a day, not a big deal. But I wanted to stay anonymous, and I wanted to speak about this at the same time. So I would message them back and say, yes, one of our contributors does some public speaking. We'll put you in touch with her. And then I'd go over to my personal Twitter account and message the person and say, hey, I'm Karen Catlin. I contribute to Better Allies, and hear you that you're looking for a speaker. Tell me more about your event. So I started speaking about this on the stage. And every time I spoke, someone would ask during the Q&A, hey, Karen, do you have a book? Because we want more of this. This wasn't enough. We want more. For a few years, I kept saying, no, I don't have a book. Sorry, no, I don't have a book. But I have finally written my book, and it is called Better Allies. And in fact, this is the second edition, which just came out in January. So it's hot off the presses to a certain extent. And I'm thrilled to be here to be talking with all of you. Okay, that was a long backstory. Woo, you got the first edition. It's a classic, yes.
That's great, and certainly my experience has been, having been introduced to it, that's one of the great powers of what you're doing is the simplicity of it. So because it's such a big issue, many of us can feel paralyzed by not really knowing where to start. And for me, one of the things, my experience of it has been, you make it so simple, it's an everyday action, that then I lose my excuse, because when it's too big, I've got an excuse for why I haven't done anything about it. But once you provide a really simple solution, then either I do it, or actually I've got to own up to the fact that I'm not committed to making a difference, which for me has been a really challenging experience and very welcome. But I wonder if maybe for those who aren't familiar with the whole Better Allies concept, perhaps you could just define a few of the key words that you use, particularly what you mean when you say allies.
Yes. So allies are people who use their privilege to help other people. And we can talk a lot about privilege, but basically realizing that not everyone is experiencing the workplace the same way you are, because maybe of your gender, your skin color, or some other aspect, your sexual orientation and identity, your age, your abilities. Everyone is not going to experience the workplace in the same way you are. And so looking out and making sure that you are opening up opportunities and kind of leveling the playing field for your colleagues who have less privilege than you do.
That's really helpful. And And I guess it's time, because so particularly I'm really keen, before we kind of go into any more detail, just to acknowledge and just take a moment to reflect on the pain, the anger, the grief that I know is being experienced right now by many of my colleagues following the disappearance and the murder of Sarah Everard and the events that have followed that, where many of my colleagues will have far more deeply personal experiences and perspectives on the issues that has raised, particularly around violence against women. And it's clear from the conversations that we've had in our team that those events are experienced very differently by men and women, and far more personally by women. Similarly, looking back to last year, that Black people experienced the killing of George Floyd far more personally than white people did. I wonder if, with your expertise of fostering inclusive workplaces, whether you could share some insight into the positive steps that each of us can take, particularly during those kind of times when different groups of people experience the same event in very different ways.
Right. And building on the tragic collection of events you just mentioned, I'll also say here in the States, we are grieving over the murders of Asian American women in Atlanta, which just happened 2 days ago. 8 people were murdered. And so the Asian American community, and of course allies to that community, are grieving now as well, and experiencing it in a very different way than I personally am experiencing it. I'm not fearing for my personal safety, for example, where I do have Asian American friends who are. So how can an ally act when these high profile or even smaller incidents occur in a community? How can an ally act? First of all, acknowledge it. Acknowledge that you have been paying attention to the news, and reach out to someone. If you have a woman colleague, or back with Black Lives Matter and George Floyd, reaching out to Black colleagues, saying, I have been paying attention to the news, I've been reading about what's happening, and I've been thinking of you. No need to respond to this message, but I just want to let you know I'm here for you if there's anything you need. Simply acknowledging it can go a long way, and start a dialogue. And I do like the approach of no need to respond, because you're giving them an out. You're not putting a burden on them to have to, support you or get back in touch with you if they're not willing to do that, or ready to do that, or in the right mind space. So that's the first thing. But then look for other things you can do to, once you realize that people are grieving or distracted. If you're wondering, based, after the news about Sarah Everard was announced that she was murdered, if you're wondering if the women that you work with are distracted, they probably are. So realize that people are distracted, they're not able to do their best work, and figure out what that might mean. I was talking to someone yesterday, a software engineer, and she works on a team that they have to have pager duty. So they have a live service that they take turns for a week, holding the virtual pager duty. And if the site goes down, it's their responsibility to address it. Well, the person on her team who has pager duty this week is an Asian American woman. So the software engineer reached out to her colleague and said, hey, I understand what happened in Atlanta. If you need some time, if you need some self-care time, let me know. I'll take on pager duty for you. What a wonderful everyday act of kindness to let someone have that time that they might need. So I think that I think I'll leave it there, but I think that acknowledging it and then looking for how you can best support someone in a time of grief like this.
Yeah, I'm really conscious that my instinctive reaction, particularly when it's sensitive, is I get nervous, I get self-conscious, and so then I withdraw and I don't say anything. And of course, then the not saying anything can compound the issue rather than do anything that's particularly positive.
Right. And Ben, I'll just say, if people want more than what I just feel like I've skimmed the surface here, there's a wonderful article by Michelle Kim. In fact, if maybe someone on the staff has a link to this, they could afford it. But Michelle Kim wrote about how to handle traumatic events, so like workplace trauma. And Michelle is a colleague of mine in the DEI space, and I really, I love her writing on this topic. So some very specific things you can do. You can Google Michelle Kim workplace trauma, you'll find her article.
Great. Thanks, Karen. That's really, really helpful. Now, going back to some of the terms you use, one of the terms you use a lot that really struck me was privilege. You talk a lot about privilege. Why is it so important for allies to understand their own privilege?
Yes. Yeah. In my book, I call it the P word, because I think there's a little bit of concern, like people don't even want to talk about privilege. And it comes down to us getting defensive when our privilege is pointed out. We get defensive because the initial reaction is, well, what do you mean I'm privileged? You make me sound like I've never had to work hard in my life, or I haven't had challenges or struggles to get where I am. And that's not what privilege is all about. It's not calling anyone a lazy bum. It is simply saying you have certain abilities, or you have certain things that have been given to you, sort of social standing because of the social groups that you are a part of. It is things that are unearned that you benefit from. So a lot of times, yes, it's because of the color of our skin. It's also because of our gender. But it's so much more nuanced and what is called intersectional. There are multiple overlapping ways privilege can show up and take away from our ability to navigate the world the way that people with all the privilege have. Things such as financial privilege being, I'm not worried about paying my bills. I've got some money in the bank that will see me through some rainy days, so to speak. And that allows you to, back before the pandemic, but like, yeah, I'll go out for drinks, go to the pub, for example, with coworkers. It's not going to break my bank. I can afford to do that. There's also caregiving privilege, or non-caregiving privilege. People with young children or elderly people in their lives that they are caring for can't necessarily just drop everything they're doing at home to work late on some big project that might be happening. So there's certain privilege when you don't have someone relying on you for caregiving. And the list goes on. So in my book, as I was doing research for that, I did curate a whole long list of ways you might have privilege in the workplace. And it's a list of 50 ways. And so I encourage people, even if you don't have my book, you can go to my website, betterallies.com, and download the list. You'll see this list of 50 ways you might have privilege in the workplace. Look through it, understand your privilege, and then start realizing, oh, not everyone, for example, knows that when they go to a meeting that they have a confidence that they will be listened to. That's privilege, when you have that just confidence that, of course, people are going to hear what I have to say because my ideas are going to be awesome, and they pay attention to it. Not everyone has that confidence. Again, privilege. Anyway, Ben, did you take a look at that list of 50 privileges? Any surprises to you as you look through it?
Yeah. Well, good question. Yeah, I certainly did. It was one of the starting points, actually, and Grace pointing me to it. Yeah, in fact, manyfold. And you mentioned that one about having confidence that people will listen to me. Yeah, I tick that one. I've got confidence that people will listen when I talk in a meeting. I've got that privilege. So one of the things that struck me was actually 47 out of 50 I ticked really quickly. So it's like, wow, okay, that's a lot. And then I was thinking, actually, the 3 that I didn't tick, at least 1 or 2 of them were voluntary choices of mine that then I had borne a consequence of that, but I had entirely chosen that route. So, well, okay, that I still had the privilege, really. But one of the things that really struck me was there was a couple, I think it was one about feeling physically safe at work, and one about feeling physically safe to leave work late at night or after an evening meeting. And what struck me about those is it just never crossed my mind. So it's not something that I would have thought, oh, I feel privileged because I'm sitting at my desk and feeling safe. I just completely took it for granted, or that I could do any work event and take for granted that I'll leave late, and that's fine. So one of the ways that I found it really helpful was, one, just the scale of, wow, okay, there's so many things that I take for granted, and then the unknown, just completely oblivious to me. Points. So
I want to share a quick story. And in fact, I have just written this up for my newsletter this week. As you know, I have this weekly newsletter called 5 Ally Actions. And I am going to be talking about personal safety this week. And the story I wrote up, so I'll share here too, is I was on a panel last year with a number of people, including this male tech leader. His name's Charles. And Charles told me a story about how he was traveling to a conference with a woman who was on his team and realized that they were on the same flight. And so he said, "Oh, do you want to share a taxi from the airport to the conference hotel when we land?" And she said, "Oh, I'm not staying at the conference hotel. It was full by the time I booked. So I'm staying across town at a different hotel." And his reaction was sort of like, "Oh, that's too bad. That means you're going to have more expense filing, paperwork to do because you're going to have all of those receipts to get to the conference and go back." Like he's thinking, "Poor thing, you have more paperwork to do." And she's like, "That's the least of my worries. I have had really scary incidents taking taxis and probably shared, driving services. I've had really terrible experiences. So twice a day, I'm actually worried about my personal safety now for this conference. Twice a day when I get in the car in the morning to go to the conference and when I go back home. That's what I'm worried about." Well, this guy, Charles, bless him, he swapped hotels with her. Okay. So he recognized his privilege. He didn't have this concern about personal safety. He recognized it and he took action. He swapped it. And by the way, he took it a step further in that he told her, "I will talk to this conference that's a yearly conference. I'll talk to them and make sure that we can prioritize the hotel rooms at the conference hotel for women attendees in the future." That's a great ally action.
And that strikes to one of the things that really hit me in reading your book was the differentiation between knights and allies. And I thought that was such a perceptive challenge, because I think certainly personally, I can much more easily resonate with the turning up and being the knight. I can save you. I can do this kind of big visible act.
I can swap hotel rooms with you. Yes.
Yeah. Aren't they great? And your challenge is saying, well, okay, knights are one thing, but allies are the people who advocate for systemic change, who will act behind the scenes, who will make sure that it's not just that one individual that's saved and that they maybe get the glory and feel great that they've been the knight, but that they've worked behind the scenes to change it for everyone, and that ripples through. And I thought that was such a good challenge. Yeah. I wonder if there's a time that someone's been your ally that maybe you could share.
Yes. Oh, yes. My favorite story, and it's in my book, but I love sharing this too. It's my favorite one. When I first joined Adobe, I was a member of the senior leadership in engineering. And I remember attending a large meeting because there are many senior leaders in engineering. And I heard my boss, who was a senior vice president, I heard him say, "Well, what I learned from Karen Catlin is," and he went on to say something. He went on to say something that I had shared with him in a one-on-one meeting the previous week. And so he summarized what we had talked about. Well, that was such a great ally move for me because he was endorsing me publicly among all my new peers. He was giving me this boost of credibility that I didn't necessarily have before, because here he was, a senior person who had learned something from me, the new hire. And he made me feel great in the moment, I must admit. And there's no A/B test. I can't really tell what the impact of that was moving forward, but I really do believe it helped me navigate my new workplace to get appointments, meetings with the men, my peers, and start talking to them about some strategic initiatives I wanted to push forward and so forth. I have a feeling that made a difference. He helped open a door for me to start having a lot of conversations. So that's an example of just a simple thing, like endorse people publicly, tell people what you learned from others, give them a shout out.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah,
yeah.
Really good.
Do you have an ally story? Time that you acted as an ally, okay. Or maybe wished you'd acted as an ally?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because and in fact it strikes to one of my kind of almost instinct reactions to the whole question is actually one of a bit of guilt, maybe weakness, vulnerability on the whole area. So they're kind of, you ask, how have I been an ally? And immediately I'm thinking, oh, have I? Can I share it? Oh, okay, yeah, I'm not sure I'm very good at this. And so then it's that kind of retreat. Oh, yeah, not sure. But I think one of the things I've been learning, and it's really helped, just some of the materials you got that help to bring up the conversations around ways that I could be an ally. That has really helped bring a few things out. And so for me, it's helped me learn the importance of just being open and sharing okay, I'm not very good at this. Help me. What do I need to do differently? And you know, another shout out to Grace. She's great on the team on being direct and challenging me on ways in which I'm not great. So actually, probably it's easy to share a way that I'm not a good ally that Grace has been able to challenge me on, and then hopefully I've been able to address. So she challenged me that sometimes I can get so enthusiastic in meetings and I'm talking, and then she just doesn't get a word in edgeways. And times even when I've introduced Grace for herself. So it's almost as if Grace can't introduce herself. I'll do it, you know, cover it all. And so then she's like, that doesn't really help, Ben. Like, come on, let's work out a way of managing these meetings so that then it works for both of us. And so then we just agreed a simple approach so that then before we go into the meeting, we know who's doing what. And that's been really helpful. And I think Grace has found it helpful. I've certainly found it much more helpful to then have some really specific things that I can just do and that it works for both of us. And yeah, that's been really helpful. But look, I'm getting a little bit nervous now because this is a couple of times you've asked me questions, so I'm keen to turn it right back on you. And so what I did before we started this is I reached out across the university to a number of colleagues across the university to ask them if they could share any examples maybe that they've witnessed where there have been challenges, and to ask you then, how could an ally act in one of those scenarios? So I've got several. We're going to go fairly quick fire, and I'm really keen to hear your insights on these. So the first one, we've got Jo Slater-Jeffries. She's the Associate Dean for Enterprise in the Faculty of Environment and Life Sciences. And let me read what she said. She said, she highlighted that when someone in a meeting adopts someone else's idea or opinion as their own without giving any credit. So it can be done by anyone to anyone, but the reality is men do it so often, so frequently that they adopt women's ideas without giving credit, that the term hip eating has been coined for precisely that event. So what can an ally do when they see that happening?
Yeah, and I call this idea hijacking, because frankly, women can do this to other people too. It's not just the men, but hip eating is a great term too to kind of shine a light on it. So what can we do when we see someone hijacking someone else's idea and potentially getting all the credit? We can point it out. So we can point it out, and not in a shaming, blaming kind of way, because again, someone maybe just overly enthusiastic and talking about an idea that they heard earlier and just are getting swept up in the moment and not being malicious. So we don't have to shame and blame, but we can point out the originator. And so doing something like, hey, I see you agree with the point that Jo made earlier in our meeting. You know, something simple like that to make sure that Jo gets the credit. Or if it happened to be something you heard presented the previous week and then someone else is claiming it as their own idea, it's like, yeah, you know, when I attended Jo's presentation on this very topic last week, I learned blah, blah, blah. So you can look for ways to just make sure that you're paying attention, and you're going to call out and make sure that originator gets the credit that they deserve. Amplify them. Yes.
One of the things I found really helpful in your book as well was this idea of the back channels in meetings as well. And actually, if it's something that does happen often, that then actually you can get organized before a meeting and just have a group of people that are going to be allies for each other. And that you can then just give them a trigger if actually you need some help in the meeting and it would be inappropriate for you to say it, that maybe one of the allies that you've already got in the room, maybe you can just prompt them to help you out and do it in a non-confrontational way, maybe.
Yeah. Or even that person message them and say, hey, dude, you forgot to give Jo a shout out, right?
Yeah.
And let them, you know, fix the wrong that might be in place.
Yeah. No, that's really helpful. So there was a related one. It's talking about meetings. So Mark Sullivan, he's the head of physics and astronomy, and he highlighted a recent example from his field. So if you're in the astronomy world, then recently your Twitter feed will have gone abuzz with a public Zoom call in which a Harvard professor, Avi Loeb, condescendingly mansplains the search for extraterrestrial intelligence to Jill Tarter, who is one of the world's leading authorities on exactly that subject. So there's a long Forbes article on exactly that if you're interested. When you watch it, it's obviously inappropriate when you watch it back. Like it's clear as day. But the challenge is actually when you're in the moment, maybe you're chairing the meeting or you're another participant in the meeting, it can be more difficult to recognize it in real time and fast enough. How can an ally act constructively in that situation?
Yeah, ideally you are seeing it in the moment. And so, you know, I'm a firm believer in criticize and provide constructive criticism in private, praise in public. I do like that differentiator. But there are times when you just have to take action in the moment. And you know, reclaiming the attention, grabbing the mic, so to speak, whether it's virtual or in person, but grabbing and saying, hey, wait a second, you know, you're explaining something to the expert in the field. I'd like to hear from her. Just say it. Now, in the moment, it may be you're almost overwhelmed. It's like, is this mansplaining? Is this really happening? You're not really thinking. So I do like having these phrases, I call it in my back pocket, that are easy to pull out. And that's a great one. Like, you know, you're explaining the topic to the expert in the field. I'd like to hear from her.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So here's another quick fire one. So I'm registering for a conference, or maybe I'm invited to be on a panel. And then I notice that all of the speakers are white men, just like me. So what am I supposed to do at that point?
Oh, yes. Yes, there's a phrase for this one too, the manel, the all-male panel. And there's also a WANL, which is the all-white panel. So if you are invited to speak on one of these, and I mean, any speaking engagement, you should ask, like, is there going to be a diversity of voices on stage being virtual too? And ask, you know, make sure that the organizer knows that's important to you, that you want to acknowledge that you are a white expert, and that you think that other people from, you know, you should have a diversity of expertise on the stage. So pointing it out, I think, is fine, and saying, I really want to have diversity. You can even do things like add to your social media profiles a statement of, like, I do not speak on all male panels, or in my case, I actually have it on mine, I do not speak on all white panels. So, and of course, here we are, you and I are both white people doing this, and we've acknowledged that a few times. If this were a larger conference and it was a whole lineup of white people, I would have stepped down, definitely. So at any rate, and if we see it, if we're not the speaker and we're registering for a conference, call it out also. The organizers, I mean, most of the organizers are tapping into their networks to find speakers. Most of us have homogenous networks that are full of people just like us. And so pointing it out that, hey, I'm not seeing much diversity. I'd like to see more diversity on stage at your event. What's your plan? And give them a nudge, a suggestion, a call out. Yeah.
Yeah, it's certainly a challenge. I struggle with is absolutely your network becomes homogenous, and so then you might think you want to do the right thing, but then it feels more difficult, and you're not quite sure where to start. But again, I think that's one of the things that I find so helpful about your approach, is it is just really simple, practical steps that we can all take, and then it removes the excuse that if it's so simple and actionable, your choice, you either do it or you don't. And I think for me, one of the examples of that was just in your last week's email in response to that really sensitive and challenging Oprah interview with Harry and Meghan, which of course here in the UK has really sent a shockwave, and all of the issues of race that it has exposed. Your last weekly email really cut through some of the heat around that and gave these insightful points around helping new employees survive and thrive in a new environment. I wonder if you could just unpack some of the points that you raised on that.
Sure, yes. So just one of the things that Meghan Markle raised was that she had asked for training on basically her new role as Duchess, training on protocol, training on the technical aspects of her job. And she had asked for it, and she did not get the training that she required. And gosh, if The Crown, the Netflix series The Crown, is accurate, I know that Princess Diana got that same training from her grandmother, who was a member of the extended royal family and was highly skilled and knowledgeable about the protocol. So if The Crown is accurate, I do know that Princess Diana got that kind of training, but Meghan Markle did not. So it made me think about, okay, what are we doing for our employees as we onboard them into our companies? Yeah, we've probably got some training and so forth on the handbooks and all of that, but who is teaching them the unwritten rules, the unwritten way of being successful in an organization, the protocol, that, if you want to call it that, of how things are done? Who is actually giving them that inside kind of scoop of how to be successful? By contrast, when reflecting, I share the story in my book about the U.S. Naval Academy. And the upperclassmen, they call them classmen, I believe, the upperclassmen at the Naval Academy are responsible for mentoring the brand new students who are joining the Naval Academy. And they call it, we give them the gouge. And the gouge it is the unwritten rules of how to survive and thrive at the Naval Academy. And I think that we all in our workplaces everywhere need to be giving the equivalent of the gouge to every new employee, and not just the employees who remind us of our younger selves. We need to be doing it for everyone and making sure that especially people from underrepresented groups have the equivalent of that mentor who is telling them how to be successful.
I remember Sheryl Sandberg making a really insightful point that absolutely so many mentors mentor people like themselves. So if all of the senior people in an organization are men, they mentor men, and they feel maybe uncomfortable mentoring women, and then suddenly you create a glass ceiling. So there's another one that came from Lorna Colhoun. She's the Director of Research and Innovation Services here, and she highlights this scenario where discussions are happening outside of work hours in a social environment, contacts are made and opinions are formed that can affect my work, but I'm unable to participate because of personal circumstances. What should I do?
Yes. So my approach is how allies can disrupt that, not put the burden on someone who is from an underrepresented group who's unable to participate. So let's think about what the allies should be doing. Allies, I want you to realize that when you are socializing, and whether that's over drinks in a pub or a virtual poker game or something like that with colleagues, you're socializing, but you are sharing some of some business insider information, some information about some new deals or competitive threat or whatever that might look like, right? You're sharing in those tips with others. And so the challenge then is, how can you share them with people who you're not just hanging out with socially? How can you diversify your network to make sure that you are really getting to know other people and giving them a fair shot at all the great ideas and insights and knowledge that's in your head, and not just sharing them with people that you want to socialize with. It's your responsibility, especially if you are a male leader or in any kind of leadership position. It is your responsibility to make sure that your team is successful. And if you are only doing that with a portion of the people that you like hanging out with, you're not doing your job.
Yeah. Okay, another one. Diana Eccles, Dean of the Faculty of Medicine here, has said that we're keen to achieve a more diverse leadership team. We monitor decision-making carefully to ensure all decisions have been made fairly, ensure that all suitably qualified individuals have an equal chance of being appointed. However, a lack of diversity amongst our applications for senior roles means we cannot be sure of a diverse shortlist. And I know we see a similar dynamic in future worlds where we want to support more aspiring founders from underrepresented groups, but often we think, oh, we're not getting people come forward. What can we do about that?
Yeah, okay. So the pipeline of talent is such an easy excuse. It's an easy thing to blame, and I've done it myself. We hire more women if we could only find them. We just can't find them. It's an easy excuse, and I get it. But there's so much that we can be doing to understand what responsibility we have in this pipeline problem. Responsibilities such as, are you, and maybe you're doing these things, I don't know, but are you actually looking at the number and analyzing the demographics of who applies for positions, who makes it through to the first round of interviews, that first screening, and who actually is on that final list of the short list, as you called it. Who are women or people of color or another demographic, are they dropping off through that whole process, through that funnel? And if so, that's where you have to go back and look like, ooh, we had a lot more women at the start than we had at the end. So what's happening in between, and figure that out and fix that. There may be, though, that there are things you can change in how you're presenting the job itself. What is that job description? What are you looking for? And are you encouraging people to apply even if they don't have 100% of what you're looking for? There's research showing that women especially, but people from other underrepresented groups have, as they look through a list of all these things, they're like, oh, I don't quite have the one, that thing they're looking for, I shouldn't apply. Where a white man might say, I'm fantastic. Of course I should apply. They'll love me. I can learn it on the job. So just there's so many things that we could be doing as allies to really address why people might not be applying or getting through the whole funnel. And I have a whole nother book on that topic, and it's called The Better Allies Approach to Hiring, where I've collected and summarized all the different places that you can be looking at to make sure that your shortlist is more diverse.
It's really helpful. So the final one that I canvassed in advance, and I can see on the chat that there's a load of questions that are coming in from the audience as well. So we'll go straight onto those afterwards as well. I'm going to keep the focus on you. Mark Spearing, he's the Vice President of Research and Enterprise here, and he brought up this scenario of a junior colleague who experiences a senior colleague being aggressive and condescending. And so that junior colleague feels undermined, they feel undervalued, but they feel unable to challenge the behavior. And so then the colleague, realistically is more likely to be a woman, but not necessarily so. So the ally steps up and raises the issue with the senior colleague, who dismisses it as just being honest and direct in their conversation. At that point, what should the ally do?
Yeah. Oh, so let's face it, we need to meet our audience where they are. You need to tailor your feedback based on the person you're giving feedback to. So this senior leader who is just being direct and blah, 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 giving that person feedback saying, hey, that's what you think, but your message isn't landing with the person who needs to hear it. So it's basically you're failing at giving feedback. That's what you have to think. But of course, the feedback can be more like, I think you need to do a better job at giving the feedback so the person hears it. I'm all about being direct, and here I am being direct with you, but I think you need to realize that that's not working with this person. And so let's try something else to make sure they're getting, they're hearing your feedback and acting on it appropriately or accordingly. Now, depending on your relationship with a senior leader, you could be even more direct. My friend, you're being a jerk. Do you realize that? If you have that kind of relationship with that person, you can be as direct as you want to let them know that this is not cool. This is not how we should be doing things here. This is not part of the values we have in our organization to be so undermining. And you're being a jerk. So what are you going to do about it? Yeah.
Yeah. Tough talk.
Tough talk.
So to keep it going, I'm looking at some of the questions that we've got coming up. Okay, so I can see Sally has asked a question. How do you deal with being the token woman on panels?
So I am sometimes the token woman on a panel, definitely. And personally, I deal with it in terms of, I don't care. That's my mentality. I don't care, because this means I am speaking about what I have expertise in and helping get my message out. Now, if you're a token woman on a panel and they only want you to be talking about being a token woman on a panel, then that's not cool. You should be talking about the expertise, just like everybody else on that panel is probably talking about their deep expertise. So insist on that you're not being the token to speak only about the token issue.
Right. Yeah. The focus on the expertise. So another question, Julia picks up on Sally's question, says, so following on from that, how do we move out of this homogenous zone into diversity without being tokenistic or seen as being tokenistic? So I've been trying to get experts into my field who are people of color onto panels, but maybe struggling. How do you get over that hurdle?
I personally, as an ally, and I will tell you, I do look for opportunities to recommend some Black people in my network for speaking opportunities. I look at it as I want to help open doors for other people. I want to be creating speaking opportunities or making connections that is it's going to be win-win. It's going to benefit everyone. So that's the mindset I take, and it's genuine. So I hope that the person who asked that question can also think about this in a genuine way. This isn't just about, oh my gosh, we need more diversity in whatever it is. We need more diversity. Who can I ask? Who can be our token? But really kind of thinking more deeply about it and like, the people that I know who could bring diversity to this event, what is their goal? What are their career goals? What are they trying to do? How can I help connect some dots? And that's when it will get beyond tokenism and be more genuine.
That's helpful. So a question coming from Paul, who says, affecting culture change can be really difficult to evaluate. Do you have any kind of metrics that you think are really helpful to measure to try to make that more robust?
Yeah. So pulse surveys or engagement surveys are a great way to measure how inclusive a team is. My approach is, let's enable everybody in an organization, in every corner of an organization, to be ambassadors of a more inclusive culture. And to measure that, though, you have to take a top-down approach in terms of asking employees things. And pulse survey experts are out there with exactly the questions, but things like, how long do you see yourself, staying and growing your career in our organization? How likely are you to recommend someone else to join our organization? Et cetera, et cetera. So I think that pulse surveys are the way to measure culture.
Cool. So Grace has asked a question. Could you share some kind of back pocket phrases for calling things out in the moment? Are there some, simple things that you can just pull straight out when you see stuff?
Yes. My go-to one is, it's all about seeking common ground and then educating someone. Here's what it looks like in practice. I was discussing a book. I was in a book club last summer, and we were reading a book called Me and White Supremacy, which is by a Black author. And our book group was watching a video of the author speaking about some topic in her book. And one of my friends in the book club said, "Oh, I loved watching the video. The author is so articulate." And okay, let's step back from that. Calling a Black person, a Black author, articulate, it's like, well, what are you comparing her to? She's an author. Of course she's going to be articulate and knowledgeable about her subject, right? So it's sort of weird. Like, what are you thinking? Like, what was your assumption going in, that a Black person possibly couldn't possibly be articulate? Like, it was just a little weird. So how do the phrase for Grace that was asking this question, what is the phrase you can use? Seek common ground and then educate. Say something like, I heard you call the author articulate. I used to think that was a compliment, but I've since learned that many Black people don't think of it as a compliment because what you're comparing them to. So I used to think that too, and I have since learned is such a great way to kind of diffuse the feedback in terms of the defensiveness someone might feel, because I'm seeking common ground. I used to feel the same way, and then educate them with what you've learned.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it's certainly one of the things I found really helpful of reading the book and some of your materials is it gives those kind of morsels of examples where you can then point to that objective third-party source and say, oh, this made me aware of this, and therefore it's less confrontational. So we had a couple that had been submitted even before the event that have come through. So one is talking about, how do you handle it if a colleague is acting aggressively or using kind of inappropriate language to someone in a meeting? Obviously that slightly kind of relates back to Mark's question, but any kind of further advice on how to deal with someone who's acting aggressively in a meeting?
Yeah, so this is one of those times, if it's aggressive and it's disrupting the meeting, you probably want to take action right away, as opposed to waiting and giving the person feedback afterwards. So this, in some ways, is the beauty of being virtual. I know there's a lot of challenges with being virtual too, but we have that back channel, which we talked about a little while ago. We have the back channel in place because we are all online. And so messaging that person and saying, hey, I need you to back down. This meeting is not going as planned, or is not getting to a productive place, something like that. I need you to back down. You're being overly aggressive right now. Cool it. If you need to actually come off of mute to do that, to get attention in the moment, I'm trying to think, and I know I'm struggling a little bit too. I'm trying to think exactly what I would say. There's power differences at play, and I acknowledge that. It kind of depends on, hopefully there's someone who's an ally who can actually take action and use their position of privilege and power to disrupt what's happening. But actually, I think if I were that ally, I might say something like, time out, maybe even use the universal timeout symbol. Timeout, this conversation is going in a different direction than I think we need to. Let's take a pause, take stock of where we are, and figure our next steps forward, just to diffuse things a little bit and calm everything down.
Yeah, that's interesting. And interesting you mentioned the online dynamic, because another question that Sally had asked was, do you think working from home and the all online meetings has made it easier or more difficult to be an ally?
Yeah, it is. I think it's easier to be an ally in online, I must admit. But I think you can do it in person too. Let's look at some of the things we can do as an ally in this virtual environment. We can put our pronouns next to our name in any profile that we have online in a meeting, which allows, it kind of normalizes, these are my pronouns. I don't have to say anything, but your pronouns can be visible right next to your name. And then people who might use pronouns that aren't necessarily how they naturally present, such as the pronoun they. It's more obvious when you're talking to someone that you now know how to refer to them because they have specified their pronouns as they, for example. So it's easier to use pronouns in a respectful way. Other things we can do as allies is not insist someone put on their video camera for a meeting. People are working from crowded homes at times. There could be a lot of distractions in the backgrounds. There could be, we're giving people peeks into our personal life that not everyone might want to be providing. So we, for example, just don't insist on a virtual settings, people turn on their cameras. And for interviews, I've heard about companies who are now reaching out ahead of time and coaching people on how to show up well for a virtual interview, plain background, those types of things, but also saying, if you need to go to a co-working space so you have a quiet space to do this interview, let us take care of that financially for you. We'll pay for your travel to the co-working space and the rental while you're there. So there's so many things we can do as allies. Just pay attention to them.
Yeah, it was great when I saw that example shared around the companies that were providing for people to have their own specific space, and just the obvious reality. Once it's stated, you realize, of course, yeah, it discriminates against people who don't have a stable internet connection, who haven't got a quiet place where they can conduct an interview. And then if immediately all of this unconscious bias creeps in, and totally unintentionally maybe, but yeah, real challenge. So talking about unconscious bias, how do you respond if you see that someone is given an unconscious demotion, i.e. assuming that the woman in the room is going to take the minutes and pour the tea?
Yeah. Okay, yes, the office housework of a meeting. Office housework are these tasks that need to get done, but maybe there's no one's job to do them. Now, if you actually are someone who, call it a tea boy, for example, I'll just say, I have a brother-in-law who started his career as a tea boy. It might be your job to deliver tea and deliver mail and do those types of things. That's fine, it's your job. But when it's not your job and you are the underrepresented person in the room and asked to do these things, it becomes something called office housework. And the challenge with the office housework is it's a demotion, definitely in the moment. You might have been peers with everyone else around the table. And now because you're asked to do this administrative work, you are seen as someone who's doing service for everybody else. And of course, if you're taking the notes or the minutes for a meeting, you're not participating in the conversation as a full-fledged member. You're kind of a step behind the conversation. So you're not contributing, making the killer points that probably you would be making otherwise. And ultimately, these things don't lead to career growth. So best practice around office housework is set up a rotation for office housework, especially for these standing meetings. Set up a rotation saying, okay, we meet monthly for this committee. We're going to take turns taking the minutes, for example, or tracking the action items, or pouring the tea, as it might be. So that's a great best practice. And for the men out there, when you see it happening, just do it yourself instead. Just volunteer. It's like, hey, I'll pour the tea today, and take that on yourself.
Great, that's really helpful. So we're coming to the end of our time. So one last question I can see. Hannah asked the question, how can you empower, and this is a really good final question really, how can you empower employees collectively, maybe at an organizational level, to be active allies? How do you do that at an organizational level?
Oh my gosh, so many ways. So first of all, I love it when people in leadership say how important this is. They are talking about their vulnerabilities. They're talking about what they're learning about allyship. They're talking about times they wish they had acted as allies. They're placing an importance on that. And so I love people in leadership, making this important. I do believe that there can be a ripple effect, whether it's the most senior person in an organization embracing allyship, or just, there's always the people in the room who are on any team who kind of set the tone and are really driving cultural changes. When those people start acting as allies, there's a ripple effect. It rubs off, and other people find it a lot easier to have that role model in their midst, and they start acting as allies too. But I will also say, I get it. It can be hard. And that's one of the reasons I send out my newsletter. So I'm just going to give myself a plug for my newsletter, because I send it out every Friday. It's called 5 Ally Actions. And what I want is to provide people some ongoing ideas. It's usually a roundup of what I've learned during the week, what's happening in the news, and so forth. And I want to keep sprinkling these ideas so that people have a regular reminder of, here are some ways you can show up as an ally. So please consider, if you're not already subscribed, to go over to betterallies.com and check that out.
Fantastic. And I would definitely recommend, I'd certainly recommend signing up for the email, but also the downloading those 50 potential privileges and using that just as an asset to then talk about in the team. So to say, right, okay, we're all going to look at that link this week. Let's just talk about those privileges, see what issues it arises. And it doesn't have to be structured, does it? Because there are so many things that come up from that, and surprising things for different members of the team, that it just facilitates those conversations, doesn't it? I wonder if there's any kind of closing comments that you would like to make, Karen, stuff that we haven't maybe covered in any of those scenarios.
Yeah. So being an ally is a journey, and there is no end point. It is ongoing. So I want to let people know, with any journey, you start with a single step. So start doing one thing that feels more inclusive to you for other members on your team. Start doing one thing and keep moving forward. And realize that on this journey, you're going to make some mistakes. Get comfortable with it. I make mistakes a lot, and I spend all my time thinking about allyship. So you're going to make some mistakes. Get comfortable with that knowledge, with saying apologizing, saying I'm sorry, learning from it, and iterating, and just keep moving forward. So so I hope everyone listening today is either already on the journey to be better allies, or is going to join me now. I'd love to have everyone partake.
That's really helpful and certainly resonant. I certainly feel like a beginner taking stumbling steps at the beginning of a journey, and it certainly can make me nervous. That's really helpful encouragement, and that encouragement to keep on learning and being happy that you're not going to be perfect and you're going to get it wrong along the way, but it's worth it. Karen, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure and just so helpful to hear that advice. I really, really appreciate it. So for everyone joining, thank you so much for joining us today. A reminder, go along to Better Allies, have a look at the website, sign up for the Ally Actions email, look at those 50 potential privileges, use that in your teams to just flush out some conversation. For us, part of our motivation in having this event is really to try and stimulate that conversation around campus, across the university, and around our networks. I know you've got some free downloadable resources as well on the website, haven't you? So discussion documents for a kind of a book club to keep the conversation going forward. So I would encourage people to go and explore what's there. Finally, for us, one of our motivations as Future Worlds for hosting this is that we want to support as actively as possible more women and people from ethnic minorities who want to launch startups, who want to be founders. And I wonder if you in the audience, maybe you want to be a founder, but perhaps you could be a sponsor of one of those aspiring founders, whether you're internal to the university or external. Maybe you're someone who can be an ally to one of those founders. If you would be interested in that, we would love to hear from you. Reach out to us, go to futureworlds.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter and keep in touch with us and future events we've got coming on. But we would love to hear from the network of people who would love to sponsor people through that journey. But thank you again, Karen. Thank you all of you for joining us this evening. It's been fantastic. Good night.